Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll give everyone just a few more seconds to get logged in, but in the meantime, I got a lot of stuff to go through. I would love for you to start by dropping in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen where you're joining us in from. Molly and I have a running bet that there's one state that won't show up all year. And so far, I'm winning, but I only feel good about winning if that chat blows up and we see how many states are represented. All right, let's see. So far, we're getting Minnesota. Love to see that. Texas, South Carolina, California, Iowa. All right. We haven't gotten a ton of Iowa. That's awesome. All right. Some more Texas, New York, Philly, Minnesota. A lot of different Washingtons. Maine. So jealous of Maine this time of year. Amazing. All right. So I'll go ahead and jump right into this. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, 2026 State Sessions, What Happened and What's Next. Now, before we dive in, I do have a few housekeeping notes. First, note that, yes, this session is being recorded, and we'll distribute the recording after the event to everybody that registered. We'll also have some time at the end for Q&A. So over on the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A button. Go ahead and monitor that throughout the event, even if you're not going to ask a question, because you have the chance to upvote what questions you really want to make sure our speakers get to. And the top voted questions will always be at the top of my list. Now, additionally, below at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button for reactions. Now, this is something new in Goldcast, which I think is really fun. If there's anything that you super agree with or that you love, I know at least I love getting that feedback throughout these events. So go ahead and throw a reaction on the screen for us to see. All right, cool. So let me introduce myself. I'm Patrick Haley. I have the incredible opportunity to speak with some of the best public affairs pros through webinars and events alongside with our AI Inner Circle and Wonk Nation, our Slack community. Wow, love seeing those reactions fly up. Also want to shout out Molly, who's supporting us from the back end of this webinar. You'll see her name occasionally in the chat, and she's the real hero of today's webinar. Now, a quick note on accessibility. If you would like to enable closed captions for this session to get that transcript at the bottom, go ahead and hover anywhere on the stage and click the closed captioning button in the bottom right corner. We'll also have a giveaway for this event. Anyone who posts a takeaway from the webinar on their LinkedIn by Wednesday, July 1st at noon Eastern time. Wow, we're being really specific about that time. At noon Eastern time on July 1st, will be entered into a drawing to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Now, to make it easy, I suggest taking a screenshot of something interesting, either from a deck or writing a quick takeaway for others in your network that you think might be useful. Also, if you take a screenshot, make sure to take several and then choose one where I look the best, where I actually have a jaw. Right. Additionally, each year we host Wonk Week, a celebration of the Gov Affairs pros who know their stuff and get stuff done. Believe it or not, the original copy wasn't stuff. And this year we're hosting a call for speakers. So it's a great opportunity for you to show off your insights, share a couple wins with thousands of government affairs pros and advocacy pros. You can either use your phone really quick to scan that QR code, or if you go to the Docs tab on the right-hand side next to Chat and Q&A, there's a few docs to learn a little bit more about where our speakers are joining us from today, and also to submit the call for speakers. So we'd love to see those come on in here soon. All right. Additionally, I think this is my last thing. If you're headed to ALEC or NCSL events this summer, I would love for you to stop by and say hello. I'll be at both events, and I love it when customers and webinars attendees come up at these events. It's like the closest thing I get to fame is when people say like, hey, I saw your webinar on XYZ and that was great. It seriously makes my day. And this year, it will totally be worth your time because we can show a sneak peek at some of the agents Quorum is building and released recently to help you save time and get more done. Now, if you're headed to NCSL or ALEC, we did just launch a poll that you can access on the right-hand side of your screen to tell us which event you're headed to. All right. That's enough for me. With that, I'd love to introduce our speakers, Andy Hackman from Serlin Haley, Henry Mohn and Holly DeShields from McGuireWoods Consulting. And Andy, I'll go ahead and toss it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Thanks to everybody that's on the line today. I'm Andy Hackman. This will be coming up in 2027 on my 25th year lobbying at the state level in all 50 states. At Serlin Haley, we're a multi-state lobbying firm. We've got offices in Boston, Washington, D.C., Augusta, Maine, and Sacramento, California. So we operate across the country on some issues. I largely handle our environmental and consumer product policy at the state level and have been doing that, like I said, for over 25 years, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today.
Amazing. Thank you, Andy. Henry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm Henry Mohn. I'm a Vice President of State Government Affairs here in Illinois with McGuireWoods Consulting. I'm based here in Chicago, but I do spend quite a bit of time down in Springfield when our legislative session is going on. And I've been with the firm for about 5 years now. I mostly handle a lot of work with our Illinois government relations team, but I also do quite a bit of nonprofit association management. And I have also done some multi-state work with mostly on the tracking side, but across all 50 states. And Holly is with us from McGuireWoods as well. So we serve quite a few other states, but most of the work I'm doing is based in Illinois here.
Great. All right. And Holly.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm Holly DeShields, based with McGuireWoods Consulting here in Austin, Texas. I've been with the firm since 2012, and I'm the director of the Texas Government Relations team. So happy to be here and look forward to a great conversation.
All right. So we only have like about an hour or so together. And from what I heard from folks who were registered, they had a bunch of questions. So let's jump right into it. Andy, I'll send this one to you first, but I would love for us all to go around on this one. So now that most states have wrapped, right, how are you using this window to prepare for 2027? Is there anything that you're approaching differently this cycle compared to past years?
Yeah, I mean, I love even numbered years with elections because it feels like we get just a little bit of our summer back. You know, we have states and odd numbered years that are going through July and into late July and August. So it's always nice to have this election year ability to kind of look at where we stand in the agenda and the cycle of issues in general. You know, I think looking at the lessons from this year and into 2027, affordability has really been a part of everybody's agenda lately. Certainly on the issues that I work on, it was a major issue this year and has really shaped, I think, the outcomes on things in the environmental space and consumer product space. And certainly for those that I know that work in tax policy and other areas, affordability really continues to be something that has had a lot of staying power this year. Obviously, we saw that sort of come out of the elections in Virginia and New Jersey last year, and it's really carried forward into this year. But as everybody knows, right, it's an election year this year. So I think 2027 is probably going to feel a little bit different than this year because I think a lot of folks know as soon as you get past that election cycle, the party that may not be in power in a state is maybe perhaps coming into power. And those folks that ran on an issue like affordability are suddenly going to start to own the economy every day henceforth from the election. And so I do think we have to adjust our messaging and think about how issues will play out in an environment where affordability is still going to be important, but is it driving votes and the way that policymakers look at having to appease certain elements of their independent caucuses in a real policymaking year or the first year in a number of states? I know Holly's going to talk about Texas, and Texas is only every other year, so game on. So from that standpoint, I do think that next year's going to feel different. We all know the bill volume is going to be a lot higher next year with new introductions. And so, as you look at those themes playing into next year, I think clients that we work with are going to have to figure out how you continue to make that issue important for those legislators, but also navigate an environment where I think we're going to see, we certainly saw out of the New York primaries last week, different elements of caucuses presenting themselves. And then on the other side, some of the issues we deal with sometimes intersect with the MAHA movement, and that pulls folks in those caucuses into places where you have to make sure you're working with leadership in a way that you understand how they're working within those interest areas within their own caucus. And so I think while affordability had sort of that unifying ability to really impact issues this year, I think it's going to be more fragmented as we go into next year.
Makes sense. Yeah. Affordability, I'd say, is probably the word of the year. I think I've heard that more in 2026 than I've heard at any point.
It's like AI dropped a little bit and affordability happened to somehow hop in front of it.
Right. Yeah. Chaos is another one that I hear a good bit. But anyway, Henry, how about you? What are some of the things that you're approaching differently in the next cycle?
Well, I was speaking of where Andy just left off. I was going to start off kind of with AI and data centers, because that's something I've been seeing a lot here in Illinois, but also kind of nationally. That has become a massive movement, both to regulate, but also in some cases to all out ban both AI and then new data center construction. And I think here in Illinois, the election influenced some of where we got with that, in that we didn't end up passing many of the AI regulations that were proposed throughout the year. And then on the data center front, the legislature actually didn't address anything. The governor then unilaterally passed an incentive pause for the next 2 years immediately following the end of our session here. But I think we've seen some similar things in other states where there are either proposals to all out ban new data center construction, or at minimum to pause the incentive. And this is something I've been seeing in Illinois, but also in Republican-led states as well. It's kind of a universal issue that doesn't seem to cut on partisan lines. And I expect before the end of this year, the state of Illinois to actually take up additional data center regulation in our veto session or in our January 2027 lame duck session. But these are things that will wait until after the election. And I do expect following the election that we will have a more progressive General Assembly than we already do. And because of that, it may actually end up pushing to 2027. But yeah, that's really where I was going to go with it. I think AI, data centers, and then another one is affordable housing, but that touches directly onto what Andy was saying there.
Totally. If you would have asked me 4 years ago if the conversation I was having with my family, like around Thanksgiving, was about data centers, I would have thought you were crazy. But now it's like very much in the picture. Holly, how about you? What are the things you're watching going into 2020?
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And of course, as Andy said, we are in an interim this go around. So I do love the even years because we are not in session, but there still is a lot of work to be done. And we're getting in preparation for the 2027 session. This is for our election cycle this go around. All of our statewides are up. We have 16 out of 31 senators that are up, as well as all 150 House members. So it is go time in election season. I'm sure everybody's kind of kept an eye on some of the bigger issue elections campaigns. As far as a U.S. Senate race, we have the competitive Texas Attorney General's race. We've had a competitive Texas Controller's Office race. So now that the dust has settled and everybody's getting ready for the general, I think the primary season is kind of closed up, but we are going to have, some considerable changes because we had so many retirements in this last go round. In the House, we will have at least, I believe, between 25 and 30 new folks. In the Senate, we could have up to 6. So that's big numbers whenever you're looking at the overall picture. We look at that as an opportunity, not coming from a hardship. They're great members to start educating that aren't totally aware of the issues, and we can go in there with our clients and make sure that they have the right foundation to make things possible during session. But as y'all said, data centers is number one, every headline in every state newspaper here in Texas. The governor's started to weigh in on it, the lieutenant governor, all of our state agencies. So that will be beyond the budget, which we have to pass constitutionally. The biggest issue, I would think, with water, utilities, not in my backyard, all of those good things. Otherwise, we have our Health and Human Services Commission up for sunset review, and that is our auditing process to continue state agencies moving forward. Every state agency has a certain amount of time before they have to be re-upped. So the Health and Human Services Commission and all 5 of our Health and Human Services agencies will be, very much concentrated on. They're looking at fraud and abuse. We're looking at, paying the federal government $826 million as of Friday in SNAP funding. That's not going to be covered. There's going to be a lot of Medicaid issues. So I really think between data centers, health and human services, the budget, property tax cuts, depending on what we have in the coffers to fund those, will all be the hot button issues. And again, along with affordability and from drug pricing to housing to education. So
it's a good
should
day.
be fun.
It's a lot. Yeah. So what do you do during the off year? Is it like?
It's still a full-time job, Patrick. I wish it wasn't, but no. There's interim hearings. We have committee hearings right and left. So it's really basic educating the legislators on what our clients' issues are, making sure the legislation from last session is implemented and goes through the right regulatory processes. And, we're constantly meeting with folks. We are going to fundraisers and working the polls and doing all of those things to support our friends and get to know folks. So it's very, very busy, just not
Right.
at this capital at all times.
Exactly. Never sleep, regardless if it's recess or if things are out of
24
session. Right. Exactly. All right. Well, let's move on to the next question here. So like if we were to fast forward to November, maybe outside of like your individual states, what states are you going to be closely watching for like potential legislative shifts, and like why those states? Henry, I'll go to you first on this one.
I am probably not as well versed in the multi-state election world as Andy over here, but I can say a lot of the big swing states from the 2024 election are probably the first place I'm going with that, because that's going to dictate what may happen in 2 years. So I'm looking at Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, states like that. And I also think that those are states that that tend to have split either legislatures and governors, or have one chamber that's with one party, one with the other. So that's kind of where I'm looking. And I think I can't necessarily say that this year's election will be a good predictor for 2028, but that's kind of where my brain is going with it. I know in Illinois, I don't really expect a ton of change. So this election is not as big as it may be in some other states, but in other states, I could see this being a major wave year. So I'll let somebody else take it from there.
Yeah. Andy, what states are you watching?
Yeah, I'll pick up what Henry said in terms of look at those states with split legislatures. I'm looking at Pennsylvania, like you talked about. I'm looking at Michigan, Minnesota, and then I've had Wisconsin thrown on the board a little bit as well. You know, those states that have had some footprint and kind of going a little bit back and forth in the past. I think I looked the other day, we've got 39 governors that aren't returning either due to term limits or ending terms. And so I think, you know, executive mansions are going to be very different looking next year. So I think that's going to be a big issue to watch as well. And I think in some states where you've got super majorities, it'll be interesting to see if we see any clawback to the types of situations where there is the ability to sustain vetoes in a few states. And I really do think it could be one of those wave years. You also have to look at a state that's had consistent one-party control for a long period of time. And is there a weird ticket splitting effect that might happen in a couple of occasions? Maine was mentioned earlier, one of those states. We'll see, if there's ticket splitting between a big Senate race, a governor's race, and we've had, one party control for the last 8.5 years or so. So, in those types of environments, does the national sort of belief that we're gonna have a pushback in the midterm year actually kind of come the other way because states have been under one party control for some period of time? I'm not saying I'm sure that's going to happen in Maine for that example, but I do think that there is some pent up continual desire for change right now. We saw that in the New York primaries last week. Whether or not that manifests itself into a wave, like anybody's guess, right? But I do think we are going to see in those split legislatures some consolidation of power, probably moving back to Democrats. And in an environment where, with the president being, from all intents and purposes across the polling, unpopular, and, does that really push into the space where we see those majorities start to flip? And I think states that haven't been on the board for quite some time and a number of sort of business client environments are going to be back on the board. And then, looking into next year a little bit as a result of those elections, like I was talking about with fringes, is the Maha coalition on the right. We've seen issues where they've gone after the business community as well. And are we playing in states where we haven't had to play in before? Utah is a state that we had issues in this year that was a surprise for a lot of folks. So I think the election is going to have impacts on every state, regardless of whether or not you see a chamber flip or not. You're going to see continual consolidation into some of these sectors that are going to change the dynamics in parties. And, we've been under that environment for the last couple of years, and I think it's going to continue.
All right. So which were the states that you said at the top that you think that there could be a big change? You mentioned Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, which
Michigan, is another one. Pennsylvania and Minnesota. Minnesota has got split control right now, so I'm going to be there tomorrow, in fact, so I might know more after tomorrow. So.
All right.
Yeah, Midwestern states, oddly enough, I grew up in Ohio, so it's odd to have Midwestern states back as swing states a little bit. So
yeah. Those are all in a row there. That's really interesting. Yeah. All right. So next question is: were there any states that you weren't working indirectly that like really caught your attention this session? Whether it was like an unexpected outcome or like a new issue gaining traction or things like that. What were some of the things that like really felt different this year, or what states really called out to you? Andy?
Yeah, so in Utah, I think that was kind of interesting to see some of the dynamics around and on an issue that I could certainly hold up as a case study, where you had a MAHA movement pick up an environmentalist issue that we have seen in other states that have been very progressive in another state and run with this issue. And it was quite surprising to sort of see how that influenced the larger leadership coalition. Business community that's been pretty strong in a state like Utah really had to turn and point quickly into this as it moved relatively fast. And so I think, the continued fracturing within both parties' coalition base into specific interest groups that aren't necessarily aligned with the larger message. Certainly we believe that Republicans have been pro-business, low tax, anti-regulation for the last number of years, and Democrats have sometimes been tagged either wrongly or rightly in terms of looking to have government more involved in businesses. And we're certainly seeing sort of different approaches where that political spectrum, I think we all have said this before in our presentations, right? The political spectrum is a circle. It's not a left and a right. It's a circle that meets right back in the middle. And, I think data centers is another good example, and privacy policy. We are seeing, those sectors within the parties essentially drive policy in a unique way. And it becomes something where leadership doesn't have the same level of control because you've got cover on the other side of the political aisle. And that makes for a very challenging environment. We all focus, I think, a lot on leadership and committee leadership and chairs and those types of things in our advocacy. And it's when those issues cross over that you have to create a different sort of coalition, obviously, potentially one in the middle that leverages some of that institutional leadership mechanism to try to get success on things. But I think we're going to, we are in a change environment. I think, I was reading sort of comparing in history where we are and where we've been. This feels a little bit like Reconstruction after the Civil War, where we've got different fractions of political parties that are driving parties in a very different way than we've experienced for at least the last 60 or 70 years.
Wow. Well, that's huge. So, all right. Holly, how about you? What are some of the things outside of Texas that you're watching? Also, I really appreciate you working with the audio stuff as well back in there. So we'll see how it comes out.
We'll see if this works better. So sorry about that.
Oh.
Yes. So is it better, Patrick?
Yes, it's great. Great. Yeah.
Okay. Great. We're kind of our own country over here, and so we don't really. Not that we're not paying attention to national news and what's happening in other states, but all eyes on Texas, and we kind of stay in our little bubble. We keep an eye on Florida and Georgia, of course, but first thing I ever tell a client is please don't go into a meeting and tell them what you're doing in California or New York, because we're going to do the polar opposite, whether it's right or wrong. So with that being said, I think we're kind of tunnel vision on Texas and next session and what's going on here, and we've got plenty to keep us entertained here.
All right. All right. How about you, Henry?
I would say, so there's really two levels of it from what I've been focusing on. I think Andy brought up data centers already, but that was one thing where I was surprised to see some of the stuff that was happening in other states like Ohio, Utah, Arizona, passing incentives through either Republican legislatures or by Republican governors. And that was something that we were monitoring pretty closely here because we have a Democrat governor who is pro-economic development and originally supportive of the data center incentive. So that's something that I think we were monitoring very closely here. But I also think generally I tend to either monitor states like California and New York that are large states with Democrat trifecta control, or states in the Midwest like Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, because those tend to be a lot of the states where if Illinois, especially downstate Illinois, is going to be competing in projects or competing in demand for certain industries or certain issues, then they're often going to be competing against those states nearby. And I don't think it's been particularly surprising in those states, but I do think that there are times where we are modeling our policies after more of a California or New York on the environmental side or on the affordability side. And then there are times where on the incentive side, we're looking more towards Missouri and Indiana and Wisconsin. So that tends to be where I've been monitoring recently.
Interesting. All right. Now, this is one that I've been really curious about, which is about like how are the legislative offices operating themselves? So, like, have you noticed any shifts in legislative offices, like whether it's around like AI adoption or things being more polarized, or just changing the way that they engage with lobbyists and other folks in the government affairs space? Andy, I'll throw this one to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I've not had any legislator confirm or deny this, but I do believe that there are staffers that are using AI to write legislation at this point. It's just too coincidental to see certain concepts show up in the wrong space and connected to the wrong concept in some of the drafts that I've seen, particularly obviously in the last year. Again, nobody's admitted that to me, but I think we've all looked at legislation and gone, how did these two things end up in the same bill? So I absolutely think it's being done. I have heard from legislators that they occasionally use it in sort of constituent services, which obviously from a lobbying perspective, we interact with a lot less. But I do think one of the changes is particularly, we'll have a budget bill or a massive policy bill dropped on us in a particular state that'll be 200 pages or 300 pages, and everybody expects everybody to understand it much quicker these days. And obviously AI is giving us tools to do that. But I think it has really shortened the amount of time that lobbyists like us have to review things with our clients, get back to staffers, and it has just sped the process up quite a bit. Now, does that mean that we can have a better, comprehensive understanding of what the policy is instead of taking a week to do that and focusing in one area? Probably. But does it mean we're making the best policy decisions in this environment that continues to speed up? I think that's just a dynamic of where we are. I can remember when you had to call committees and they would fax you a copy of the bill. I mean, that's where I go back to. So we definitely are in a new environment. It is going to be faster, and I think we all have to be able to adapt to that and use tools when that's necessary. But we've all had the occasion where the other day I asked the AI, I said, okay, did you look at the right section of this statute? And the AI said back to me, oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't. I fused that, and it said so, but it made a very, very tangible error. And when you're comparing statutes and comparing precedent and everything, I think we all feel like we can be an expert pretty quickly. And I think we all do need to still slow down just a little bit in order to be credible. And the barriers for staff and understanding an issue, right, from a 50-state lobbyist perspective, a lot of the cachet that we have going from state to state is talking about precedent and talking about where your client or your particular interest has been in other states to create, uniform network or uniform ability to operate. And you have to now anticipate that the staffer has had AI do a comprehensive search on this issue prior to any meeting to go into. So you've got to be prepared for that type of scenario. And you need to probably start thinking about what is the AI going to be telling the staffer or the legislator that I'm meeting with in advance of a meeting, and make sure that you can navigate through that type of space where, yes, you might be talking to a 19 or 20-year-old staffer, but they're going to believe that they have the knowledge base of a 20-year professional.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's totally good. It speeds everything up. So of course the expectation is that things are going to be faster. And then think about the staffers, they use ChatGPT to get through college and get through high school. So they're going to use it now too. So, all right. Holly, how about you? What are some changes that you've noticed with the legislatures, whether it's about AI adoption or, just like the way that they're, engaging in day-to-day?
I think it's going to be a telltale sign going into the 2027 session with all of the use of AI. I know it's somewhat used in 2025, but how far we have come over the last 18 months while we have been out of a legislative session. So I think going into next January, we're going to see probably a lot more legislation filed, just because, as y'all mentioned, it's being drafted by AI. But I will be interested to watch what the transition is from last session to this session and the usage by the members as well as the staff. I think, at the end of the day, it's still all about relationships in our business. And I hope the staff sees that is why they're in these roles, and that this is really about who to call, who can help you, who can get the ball over the line. So AI can take us so far as to being a resource and something that we can utilize. But at the end of the day, it's still all about us and walking the halls and shaking hands and helping friends out and, just working as hard as we possibly can. So
totally.
Shall see.
Henry, how about you? What are some of the big changes you noticed?
Similar to what Andy said, I can't confirm if legislation is being written by AI, but I can definitely confirm that staffers are using it to analyze as well as to summarize legislation and present that out to the public. And so I think that has definitely gotten to a point where I have caught a few more errors, but especially in the big budgetary related bills and the things that not everyone reads 1,000 pages of. But also in some simple bills where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see it because it's only 4 pages of text and you could easily read through and catch that in a drafting mode. But that has been a pretty big change. I think the other more general change that I've seen recently is about distancing between, especially on the Democrat side, moderates and progressives. I think that has really, and I think it's more pronounced here in a state like Illinois that has supermajority Democrat control in both chambers, but I think it's happening in many states as well, where the moderates would like to be able to venture off and align themselves both with the moderate Republicans as well as with the progressive Democrats as well. But as the progressive caucuses grow stronger and bigger, there's going to be a point where there may be a disconnect that is either too great to bridge or to the point where the moderates are not able to vote for some of the signature pieces of legislation that the progressives would like to be able to move forward with. And I don't think that is necessarily a trend for this year or 2027 or even 2028, but we are trending in that direction, and especially pronounced in the states with supermajority Democrat control.
Totally. Going back to what Andy was talking about with the realignment, right? We're seeing massive shifts in coalitions right now. And then Andy, you touched on affordability and how affordability became a frame to use across the political spectrum. I'm curious, what other messages are working well with legislators? Or how are you changing up how you communicate with legislators or how you coach your clients to perfect their message? What's working better now than it used to, or what are the big things that you're really coaching people towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think shorter is still better, particularly in this environment. Obviously, from a lobbyist perspective, having a relationship, I think to Holly's point, and making sure that whatever client we're bringing in is able to speak to their relationship with the state, with the legislator, et cetera. I mean, that is what rises above the din, and that still is the case, right? We've all sort of probably seen tools that are trying to take grassroots and convert them into AI and what that's going to look like. And I just think similar to the first email that was ever sent, there's just, you have to assume there's that background noise, and trying to get your message into a shorter, more concise approach to things. We work with a lot of clients that have great technical expertise and spend hours trying to bring those meetings in and bring those talking points into shorter, more concise types of messages. But I do think, the dynamics of our democracy, the dynamics of our public process continue to be the same. They may be going faster, and the square that we're talking in might be a louder square that we're talking in. But I do think that the fundamentals still are the same, making a personal connection with a legislator based upon your relationships, your counsel's relationships in a particular state, if you have counsel, is really important. And being polite too, this is something still that's sort of, again, fundamental and how I think we've all started, and part of why we're in this business is we like people, and being polite to people is an important thing. I do feel like it's unfortunate that floor speeches these days sometimes can get pretty partisan, and things continue to be more partisan, but we are at the state level. Folks have to pass budgets together. There still are things that have to be done in a collaborative manner, maybe not so much, a full compromise like they were 10 or 15 years ago, but I think there still is that ability to go back to basics when it comes to cutting through the noise and recognizing that we're still in a business that deals with people and deals with solutions. And I think always, if you come with it from that perspective, you work with your clients, work with folks that are engaged in the public process, and just remind them of that. Particularly when we're in this environment where everything is data driven, the internet drives greater data, greater clicks, et cetera, making sure that before you go into a legislative meeting and before you get on a Zoom, and this Zoom environment's great because we can do something like this and none of us had to travel, and we do more legislative meetings this way, but still approaching these meetings with legislators in this environment with the same care and the same ability to speak together and to speak humbly and truthfully to those that are making decisions is still the fundamental, I think, of getting to success.
Yeah. It's always a good strategy to be a good person, no matter what other, AI tools, stuff like that you layer on top. Holly, how about you? What are some of the things that you're coaching folks on, or you're really trying to keep in mind when it comes to like the message that you bring to lawmakers?
My number one thing with the client is let's be proactive and not reactive. Let me go in and make the introduction when we're not asking for something. I want to build them up as a resource so they know, the legislative offices know to call us to get the information that they're going to need to make an educated decision. So reactive is just, it's just harder. You're uphill battle. You're coming in with, kind of behind the ball. And so I really appreciate when people get out front of promoting who they are and building their reputation in and around the Capitol, and especially when my name's attached as well. I think that, the personal connection is very, very important. And I always try to link the client, whether it's where they went to college or where they grew up, or they have a grandmother that lives in this town or something, trying to figure out what the personal connection is immediately when we walk in there. So you just kind of deflate the business side and the negotiating side of the room. I think also clients, I'm big on making sure that they show their Texas presence. And if they don't have a Texas presence, explain first and foremost why you want to be in Texas, why you're engaged in Texas. But I think that goes a long ways across both aisles of why are you here and what is your connectivity to what we're trying to do for the citizens of Texas. And I'd say last but not least, to Andy's point, elevator pitch, what we need to really summarize needs to be put in 30 seconds and explained very succinctly. We can get into the details if they want to get further into the details, but it just goes back to that one pager they leave behind that the staff is going to have 30 seconds to glance at. And if they don't see what your number one point is, then everything's negated. So.
Yeah. And then tie it back to Texas. Like that's
exactly. It all goes back to Texas, Patrick.
Everything goes back to Texas. I love it. Henry, how about you?
I think both Holly and Andy gave great answers there. I think one of my favorite things, especially with my statewide association clients, is to bring somebody from the same area as the legislator directly into those meetings and build those personal connections deeper than I individually would be able to do myself. I know not all private clients have the luxury of being able to do something like that, but I do think that there's a real value. And if you're able to fly your clients out for a lobby day and just get them in front of as many key legislators that have the ability to actually influence the policies they're on as much as possible. But that does come down to making sure you have the materials presented, making sure that you have set things up ahead of time and done as many pre-phone calls as possible to get yourself lined up and get those meetings set up ahead of time. But I also think having that 30-second elevator pitch is probably the most important thing, because some of the best conversations I have are just when you catch somebody at the last second. You're not really expecting to run into them. You're carrying a one-pager. They ask you a question about it, and it leads to somebody becoming a huge supporter for an issue that you may not have thought that they would have been involved with. So I do think it's those person-to-person interactions are still king in this. And I think even in an AI world, they always will remain that way.
Totally. All right. And with that, let's go ahead and jump over into the audience Q&A. As a reminder, over on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. Feel free to upvote any questions that people or that you really want to get answered, and then go ahead and throw in your own questions in there. We'll start with a question from Micah. Interested in hearing about how states are approaching AI and privacy regulation in the face of potential federal preemption. Who would like to take a stab at this one first?
I mean, I can jump in with some of the things that I've witnessed, not having worked on this issue in all 50 states. I would say until there's actually preemption, as I think those of us that operate in the state world know, they don't care. The state, environments do not care if there's a threat of preemption until they've actually been told, probably by their attorney general that they trust in their own state, that they've been preempted from taking action in a particular area. So it has certainly felt like it has been the year of exploring AI and trying to develop some sense of what AI is going to look like from a future perspective. I think on privacy, there's been a lot more done in privacy over the last 5 to 6 years. There's certainly those that are experts in national privacy policy, of which I'm not one, but we have seen a number of states try to push beyond. Maine is another example. Vermont tried to push beyond. Maryland is still, I think, trying to implement their law as they've pushed beyond the national model on privacy and put some things in place that have not been tested other areas. But Maryland is still kind of the one that I understand is the most progressively out there on privacy, for example. And Maine and Vermont, both tried to go far as well. Maine did not pass something this year, and Vermont ended up passing something and sort of stepping back to something that's more consistent. So I think there is some hope for trying to work in every state on AI and privacy issues towards some greater level of a concurrent model. But I do think that the idea of preemption continues to be something in both red and blue states and purple states, that there is general disrespect for preemption until they're physically told you can't touch that rail. That's just certainly been my experience. I would recommend if you think there's preemption, having walked into that landmine on occasion as well, you need to be sure that there's preemption if you're going to walk into a legislative office and say you can't do this. That is not something that goes over particularly well, and had to caution some of my clients as well that let's make sure we put context around this preemption argument before we run into a legislative office that is hell-bent on trying to do something here in whichever state. So there are times that I've said, preemption discussions at the federal level aren't actually helpful in the state level, because if you can't get it done at the federal level, it just kind of opens a Pandora's box at the state level. We'll see if that, is the case with regard to AI policy or not. But you got to stick to landing federally if you're going to get preemption in order not to sort of encourage more activity at the state level.
Interesting. Love watching federal and state landscapes interact. I'm very curious to see what that's going to look like after the midterms. With that, we did see, got another question here from Jordan, who's got a ton of votes, which is with various changes coming from HR 1 that will require funding from state legislatures, how will states approach funding these programs, particularly as tax increases aren't popular? We'd like to take a stab at this one.
What I've seen, sorry
Yeah,
about that.
Good.
What I've seen in this space specifically is they won't fund them. That's the solution. If it's going to require state funding in the massive billions of dollars, which some of this will, they will just go ahead and cut the program. Try to place as much of the blame onto the federal government as possible to avoid any political ramifications there, and just move forward. But I can say in Illinois, our most recent budget did include one small measure to try to address SNAP cuts that are impending from HR 1. It's called the FRESH program, which provides, I believe, $400 one-time lump sum payments to individuals who stand to lose SNAP benefits due to the new work requirements. And it's a one-time program. It's a one-time cost of, I believe, about $75 million. So it's a pretty limited cost. It's a political win, especially for a governor who has potential presidential aspirations, but it doesn't actually end up costing the state that much. That's kind of the model that I see states going with this in order to move forward and try to get some kind of a win out of it, but without actually spending a large amount of money to replace huge federal funding cuts that will not realistically be able to be made up by the states.
Interesting. And another question from Jordan as well, and I'll direct this to you too as well, Henry. Selfish question: are the Chicago Bears leaving Illinois?
I saw this question. I was hoping I'd get a chance to answer, but personally, I think it's more likely than not that they stay in Illinois and move to Arlington Heights. This is almost certainly going to be worked out by the end of this calendar year. So we have a fall veto session at the end of October, or the end of November and early December. And throughout the summer, I know all summer long, they have been negotiating on really two models, that one passed the House, one passed the Senate, and they couldn't actually agree on one model to get through both chambers before the end of our session at the end of May there. So we are currently negotiating this, but the Senate model was something that came up in like the final few days of session, and it's a very traditional municipal stadium funding bill, which allows certain Cook County municipalities to move forward with a stadium funding program for public ownership by the municipality rather than by the state. The House version, I think, is a little bit more interesting, actually, but it's also a little bit more controversial. So it's a full-on pilot mega project incentive, which is something that a lot of other states already have. It's a payment in lieu of taxes, which basically allows the municipality to negotiate a tax incentive or a property tax consistent rate for all of the for a specific project area, as long as the project meets a certain threshold of spending for the area. And I would like to see that one move forward personally. I don't know if that will actually go forward. There was some pretty strong opposition, especially from Chicago legislators, but also from some downstate Republicans who don't want to give the Bears a break to move to Arlington Heights. So that one would be more interesting because it would also apply to other large-scale projects in the state who want to come in and develop and can negotiate a property tax incentive for themselves. But I do see one of those two things going through, as long as the Bears get property tax certainty and they have a way to build a brand new dome stadium that they would own rather than like the current arrangement, which is through Soldier Field, which is owned by the city of Chicago on land that is owned by the city of Chicago, then I think they will end up moving forward. The only thing that's been consistent from the state is they don't want to provide anything other than infrastructure benefits.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't have anything to add other than Indiana Bears just doesn't seem quite right. It just doesn't.
Well, yeah, you're not wrong about that. And they've done a lot of work even since they announced moving forward with Indiana. And it's all seemed to be very negative in terms of scoping out sites, environmental reviews in Indiana. Right. So it doesn't seem to be going quite as well as they'd like.
All right. So next question we'll do is from Shayna Gursky. As the federal government seems to phase out the Department of Education, how will that play in the state legislatures? What are you seeing as the core responsibilities of the department that states want to take on, and why?
I'll just say generally, I think states are going to struggle with this aspect of things. It has been, a long road to get to where we are in education policy right now. It's certainly been an area the states have been very involved in. I know in a couple of states that we work in, thinking about funding mechanisms and municipal and state funding, pairing those together to fund school districts. One of the bigger challenges can be consolidation of school districts and those types of things. And so that all, I think, feeds into the fact that this is going to be this, along with some of the healthcare cuts, coming out of HR 1. A lot of that hasn't even been really dealt with at the state legislative level yet. I think that next year is when a lot of those cuts come home, and I think the challenges next year are going to be significant for this next, legislative cycle. And I think this is one of them. Not being an expert in education policy, other than the fact that my sister and my mother were all teachers, I do think that it is an area that states have not grappled with effectively enough. And this will continue to sort of exacerbate some of the challenges that we have seen.
Interesting. Holly and Henry, do you have any thoughts related to Department of Education?
Sure. So, here in Texas, the last legislative session, we passed the school vouchers initiative. So that's still getting underway, and this will be the first school year where that will be in place. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out just on a state level versus, phasing out the federal DOE. And for public education, I think we're going to be good. And we've got a very strong Texas Education Agency that's overseeing all of those programs. And I think, our State Board of Education, they're all statewide elected officials. And so they've got a good handle on the public education system. Where I see the gaps, it's going to be in career schools and the other, financing, financial aid, period. How is that going to implicate public and private higher education institutions, and who's going to be administering those things, and how are we going to educate the folks on where they should be going and what they should be doing? So yeah, I think that it's going to be very interesting. And again, to Andy's point about healthcare, there's a lot to be determined on this.
For sure. All right. Also, another question that came in recently. Sorry, trying to find it. I was moved around a little bit. On the topic of affordability, any interesting, unique approaches you're seeing to stabilizing rising municipal property taxes?
I will say that one of the issues that I work in often sort of is related to that extended producer responsibility, particularly for packaging, but across a number of different product categories, has been used in a few states to try to, I won't say fill the hole, but take the burden off municipalities for providing certain solid waste services. And so I do think that there are, I won't say unique, because these policies have been looked at for quite some time, but over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of attention around extended producer responsibility. And the number one sort of relief that provides is creating greater ability for municipalities to shift resources from solid waste into other programs like fire, education, you name it. We don't often see, municipal property tax go down as a result of these policies passing. In fact, we've never seen that, but there are different areas where we have seen state governments look at what is the responsibility that the municipal government is having to expend their property tax on, and can we come up with some other payer in the system? The mantra that large corporations come into a state and sell products or provide services, and municipal governments are struggling, and can we offset by putting a fee or a tax on those large multinational companies in order to support a policy area that then relieves tax burden, property tax burden pressure. That is something we certainly have seen in some particular areas. Whether or not that bleeds out, beyond some of the solid waste sector and to other areas, we'll have to see if that becomes a trend or not. But I do think, certainly with the states that I follow, property tax continues to be, something that's a major policy driver, and we may continue to see innovation, like EPR and other areas.
All right. I would say, sorry, go on.
No, specifically for Texas, it's also interesting because we do not have an income tax. So we are fully funded more or less by property taxes or sales and use tax. So every session since I've been in the working in and around the legislature since 1999, I mean, property tax cuts and property tax are a top 3 issue, and especially this time around. We did raise the homestead exemption last legislative session. They're going to be looking to do that again this legislative session. So there's also, the governor has a plan, the lieutenant governor has a plan, and then how do we pay for it in perpetuity, I think is kind of the end all be all question. Yes, if we have a surplus now, we can offset some of those costs, but what about 10 years from now, or God forbid, 2 years from now, when we're not going to be in a surplus situation or our rainy day fund is depleted? What does that look like? And then are we putting it back on the folks to raise property taxes rather than lower them so we can afford, state, everything the state has to offer? So I think it's just kind of a conundrum all the way around.
For sure. All right, we got a question in from Anonymous, who's not brave. I see that national fights are turning to local and states, or turning ugly. Are you using more national talking points for some of these contentious issues? This is something I've heard actually a good bit recently, talking to folks in states, is that they've been hearing a lot about some, like massive national fights. Like we've seen Gaza come up a good bit in like New York city politics, right? Or things like that. I'm curious, like when you think about some of these more like big national issues, do national talking points work as well as local talking points at all now? Or like when do you employ like these big national fights when you're talking to legislatures?
I can maybe jump in first on this one. I think you do have to approach that cautiously. I think in an academic sense, when you get to a legislature or a legislator or policymaker that is thinking in a sort of academic space of what's the right pathway for us, how do we structurally, deal with this issue in our state in a way that has progress forward and has our economy continue to be linked to those economies that are around us regionally. I think that's the time that you can have some of the national talking points about consistency, interoperability between statutes. When you're in an environment that's sort of in that academic exploratory space of what's the right solution here. You've got to be sort of at the negotiating table, I think, as well, if you're going to use those national talking points, because if you're using a national talking point to oppose an issue you nationalize that debate really quickly. And if you don't have a compromise position that involves some of those national talking points that moves you towards being a problem solver and a solution maker in that state, you're just going to continue the trench warfare that exists at the national level, at the state level. And if that's your goal, and you know it's going to entice the same type of trench warfare out of your opponent, and that it will result in a stalemate, then yeah, go for it too, maybe. But I do think you need to be careful about going into meetings initially, especially early in session, with national talking points. And nationalizing a debate early is sometimes a sure success to turn people off from your message. So if you've got an argument that's become very mature, and you know where things are, and you know there's not going to be progress, then maybe it gives you a little more flexibility. But those would be my 2 caution points on that: is you need to make sure you're either in a problem-solving academic mode to offer those talking points, or it's been such a protracted debate that you know that that's where the parties are going to be, and that there's not likely to be compromise once you engage in that type of rhetoric.
And also looking at who is starting these conversations on the local and state level. What is their end-all be-all goal? Are they looking to be a part of the national fight because they want to be on the national stage, and they're trying to start it at their local level and take that credibility to be in the headlines on a wider platform? So I always kind of look at the MO behind who's doing the talking and where the talking points are coming from, and what's their goal?
And I would say on top of that, I've found that adding national talking points in has become one of the fastest ways to either turn certain people off or to energize them in a way that ends up turning people off. I tended to avoid it unless, as Andy said, it's the time where you're not reaching a compromise and you just need to solidify your base.
Interesting. Yeah. It's a third rail. Let's not touch as much, especially in Texas, right, Holly? It's, let's talk about Texas. Right? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you everybody in the chat. We had a really active chat, and we had so many great questions, but unfortunately we hit end of time together. I did want to throw up a slide one more time to mention, if you're interested at all in joining the stage for Wonk Week, go ahead and go to wonkweek.com/speak or scan that QR. And with that, thank you so much, Holly, Andy, excuse me, and Henry, for joining us.